This manhwa begins with the introduction of the harbor city named Lith. A few distance away was a ship gradually making its way towards the harbor, and as it finally settles at the dock, the birds around flies off in several directions. Suddenly, a young man overwhelmed with excitement shouted that he'd finally made it, then soon begun to laugh with his hands raised immediately after getting off the ship. This drew the attention of all the merchants around, and soon after, they start to offer their wares to everyone who comes off the ship. Without paying them any attention, the young man's eyes continued to shimmer with excitement as he stares at the city in wonder. His name was Raymond, and he came with his party named Walker, Taryn, and Charlotte, the only girl in the group. Walker asked Raymond if he was happy, and he replied that of course he was. Wasn't it evident? Anyway, he wasn't the only one happy in this situation. The entire group was, and as they enter the city, Taryn joined in, saying he wished he could run around in joy if he is being honest. He then looks up to an imposing building in joy, commenting that their adventure begins there. It was the era of adventurers, where every adventurer from all over the world tried to create their own adventures and become heroes going through their own journeys. Also, there are gates, and beyond this mysterious portal were the appearance of all kinds of monsters all over the world. These horrifying beings were something that were not seen in the Maple world. Countless adventurers died in these gates. However, there were unimaginably valuable and powerful items that laid inside the gates, and they lure in anyone who dares to dream big. With the risk high, Walker told them that they needed a bait, and Raymond, clueless, wondered what he meant. Seeing Raymond's expression, Walker explained that they can't plan anything until they know what's inside the gate, and adventurers always die from the unknown, so they need a slave to act as a bait. Charlotte caught on quickly, and continued that what Walker was actually saying was that they needed someone to distract whatever was inside the gate while they made a run for it if things go south. Sighing heavily, she agreed with Walker, commenting that it's indeed a good plan. Immediately after, they head off to the slave market, and a man tells them to pick any of the slaves they want as bait. He recommends a duo alone in a cell, saying those two were in good shape because they were just recently brought in. Walker bought them both when he heard this. The man then wished them good luck on their adventure. They will need it. The scene shifts to the gate, and as the team approached it, Walker told everyone that he was going to mark the outside to alert anyone else that they were already inside. And from the looks of it, it seems that they were the first. He then marks it and asked them if they were ready. Raymond, Taryn, and Charlotte were equally excited hearing this, and soon after, they all enter the gate. And as they did, Raymond commented that it felt strange going through a gate. However, his eyes immediately lit up in amazement when he took a look around. It was totally different from what he imagined. Walker assures them not to be nervous, since the gates are usually away from the monsters. However, they can't use the same gate for leaving, so they'll have to find another for the exit. At that moment, Charlotte heard something behind her, so she turned around and was horrified to see a monster with its mouth wide opened baring its sharp teeth. Blood splattered everywhere as the monster bits her in the middle, leaving her lower half visible. The rest scream in horror, and soon after, more of the monsters appeared from the shadows, surrounding them, their eyes filled with endless bloodthirst. It was then that Raymond realized that all the beauties he was amazed earlier were all monsters hiding in plain sight. Walker readied his staff and begins to cast a flame arrow. He fires it to eliminate the monster that was still in the process of eating Charlotte, leaving her somewhat uneaten dead body. However, he soon realized that something was wrong, so they needed to get out of there ASAP. He shouted, telling Taryn and Raymond to tie the baits to a nearby tree. Scared shitless, one of the slaves pleaded for them to take them along, but Taryn told him to shut up and stay put. Raymond apologizes and ties them to the tree. Then the three began to run away with their tail in between their legs. The scared slave instantly got munched on, and a monster launched its claws at the other from behind. The three managed to escape with Charlotte's dead body too. A breathless Walker told the two that they don't need to clear the gate, they just have to escape it. Raymond was panicking, his eyes wide, and from the looks of it, if he managed to survive this nightmare, he was done with adventuring. Seeing this, Taryn grabs him by the collar, telling him to listen to Walker. He just needs to calm down, their current adventure was a failure, however they can always try again. He confidently commented that they'll surely make it out of there in one piece. Unfortunately for him, a monster suddenly appeared behind him and turned him into a meat crayon. Walker screamed, but Taryn was already a human pancake. Raymond, on the other hand, falls to the floor in full panic. Walker got his act together and readied another fire arrow, but the monster shot its tongue at him, and as it wraps around his neck, choking him, he was pulled into its mouth. Immediately after, blood was gushing out everywhere like a fountain as his screams echoed the entire area, overshadowing the crunching of his bones. Seeing this horror, Raymond screamed and started to fumble while running away. The monster began to slowly walk towards him, dropping Walker's half-eaten leg to take a bite of Raymond's delicious poking ass. He soon screams about his ass not being savored first. Raymond continues to scream in pain. Then, someone on a tree in front of him caught his attention, prompting him to look up. It was the slave he tied to a tree earlier, our protagonist. And like an idiot, the first word he uttered was bait. He continued in pain that he's glad he's alive. Asking for his help, Raymond mentioned that everyone was dead except them. He was truly sorry about earlier, but he needs him to get out of here alive. His ass was a lost cause, but he can still make it work. He gritted his teeth, pleading endlessly. However, the slave just stared at him, not uttering a word. Seeing him doing nothing, Raymond begged for him to just stop standing there and help an assless brother out. A smile crept on the slave's lips, and as he jumps off of the tree, he waited till Raymond was half-eaten, then said he was about to help. However, it's a shame he's too late. It was in that moment that Raymond realized that his pleas were nothing but a form of entertainment to him. He had already been devoured for the most part, and as his reflection in a pool of his own blood highlighted his realization, he laughs, cursing the slave. He also began crying, and in his final moments, he questioned the slave if he honestly believes he'll really be able to escape from this place. He was next. Karma is a bitch after all. Immediately after, he gets fully eaten by the monster, leaving nothing but his arm behind. So with the wanker done, the slave took a stance and readied his weapon. The monster's focus was entirely on him now. In a flash, the monster dashes towards him, mouth wide open, but the slave stood there motionless, thinking about something. When the monster got closer, he spun his spear, resolved. He commented that Raymond was wrong. He wasn't going to die here. After all, they weren't the same. He then stabs a hole through the monster, instantly killing it. The monster fell down lifelessly, and as the slave stood upright without looking at his kill, he continued that karma was indeed a bitch. However, he knows where and when he will die, and it was definitely not here. The scene changes to a flashback of a battlefield, and on a cliff was a man, looking at the destruction below. A white-haired girl behind the man said that something was coming. It was an army of dragons, and among them was their leader, the king of dragons, Gorntail. She guesses that the centaur's nest has fallen, and there's nothing else they could depend on since everyone else was dead. The Cygnus Knights, the Resistance, the Cross Hunters, all the adventurers, and even the 6 heroes that people saw as their ray of hope were all gone. He was the only one left, the last adventurer, El Palm. So with Gorntail's shadow cast on them, Palm tells everyone to lock in, as this will be their final adventure. Gorntail dives directly at them all, its mouth wide opened. Then, a pitch-black scene was cast, leaving what transpired to everyone's imagination. Soon a hellish landscape was brought in view, and amidst the ruined, Palm was the only one standing, or to be precise kneeling, covered in blood. Around him was all of his dead comrades. Also, in front of him was one of Gorntail's head. Palm wonders if it's over for him. Looking up at Gorntail, who flew over him, occupied with something. It was its cut-off head regenerating. It seems that all Palm's resistance and sacrifice was for naught. With the head still regenerating, Gorntail, again, flew towards Palm, who closes his eyes, accepting his fated death without any resistance. Crouching down, this was his end, the world's end and his adventure too. Thinking this, Palm suddenly punched the ground in frustration, and gritted his teeth as his eyes bulge out, intensifying his anger as he recalls all of his comrades' sacrifice. Philip, Jaden, and finally Alexis. Every one of them sacrificed themselves to save me, therefore, I refuse to accept defeat. Palm screams out of frustration and regret. He then stands back up, and with all the energy he could muster, he raised his hand and prepared his final assault against Gorntail. A golden glow shone brightly from his hands, and soon after, a massive arrow made of flames was aimed at Gorntail. However, for some reason, Palm's spell casting suddenly stopped, and he was dealt with a painful backlash immediately after, causing him to spurt out flesh blood. Meanwhile, above him was Gorntail, who released a considerable amount of his dragon's breath toward Palm's direction. Seeing the inescapable dragon's breath, moments away from incinerating him to nothing, Palm cursed aloud regrettably. In his consciousness, Palm questioned himself why everything ended the way it did. If he was more powerful, if only he had another chance. Then a bucket full of water was splashed on his face, jolting him awake. He opened his eyes in shock, confused and dumbfounded. He wondered what was going on. In front of him was a man who delightfully showed all his white teeth, mentioning that a slave should know his place. Again, Palm was in a daze, wondering what was happening to him and what occurred after he was incinerated. Is this hell? Recognizing where he was, Palm and a group of other slaves were restrained and lined up against a wall. Yeah, he was definitely a slave inside a slave market, but how was it possible the slave market was abolished a long time ago? These questions raced through his mind repeatedly as he tried to make sense of it all. Palm also recognizes the merchant as the one that was in charge of him 6 years ago. He wonders why he's here and pieces it together, but the merchant hated that Palm was constantly staring at him. So he raised his fist and punched Palm's face. On the other hand, Palm was still trying to make sense of what was happening around him. He questioned if everything was a dream, but with the realistic looking of everything and the pain from the merchant's fist earlier made him reconsider. He couldn't believe it, but he was also left with no other choice. He had a do-over, so when Walker and his party entered, everything played out like earlier. Palm decided to not overthink it and just make use of his second chance. A chance to save the people he cares about. The scene then shifts to the present where Palm picks up and examines Walker's staff, the fire arrow. He complimented the staff's usefulness, deeming it not a bad weapon. Fire arrow wasn't a bad skill, and it's perfect for his level right now. But it was not enough because an adventurer should have more than one weapon, otherwise they shouldn't dream of venturing in the gates. Up ahead was Walker's foot, and in his shoe was a ring. It was not weird to find valuables in someone's shoes since it was a common thing. He puts it on, and as he did, he noticed that it was a telekinesis ring. At that moment, a loud rumbling behind him made him look back with his spear in hand. The horde of monsters made him wonder if they smelt the blood around him. In a flash, Palm was surrounded. Then the monsters dashed forward simultaneously. However, Palm quickly made work of the nearest monsters with his fire arrows. So with each arrow creating a gaping fissure in them, the monsters result to their tongue assaults as several of them were launched towards Palm. A tongue wrapped around his spear, smashing it into pieces. This surprised Palm momentarily, and in that fraction of a second, another monster took that chance to sneak attack him. However, with the use of the fire arrow, that monster was instantly killed. Although Palm had killed a considerable number, the monsters seemed endless, and they were closing in from all directions. This prompted him to test the telekinesis ring, and as he did, together with the fire arrow, multiple monsters were pierced through with a single flaming arrow, setting them ablaze as well and reducing the horde significantly. However, it became evident that Palm couldn't keep it up for long, but due to the significant reduction, it didn't matter. Unfortunately for him, the fire arrow stopped working, making Palm wonder if it was broken or if it's on cooldown. So as more monsters kept attacking relentlessly, Palm was left with no choice but to improvise. He began to smack some of the monsters with the staff, and others with his foot, kicking their face in with great force. Inwardly, he wondered how long the staff was going to take till the cooldown was lifted. At that same time, the staff flames up, signaling that the cooldown was lifted. The monsters charged with their mouths wide open at Palm, who lights them up with an arrow, then directed multiple flaming arrows with his ring, piercing 6 monsters at a terrifying speed. Soon after, Palm was surrounded with the corpses of all the monsters. What was surprising immediately after was the voice of Charlotte. She was still alive, and as he called out to Palm in a weak tone, she commented that Palm was no ordinary slave. Hearing her voice shocked Palm greatly. He wondered if Charlotte was lucky, or to be precise, unlucky was the better choice of a word since she was going to die slowly, and there was nothing she could do about it. Charlotte asked who Palm was, and how did he get his hands on Walker's staff. Oh, and the mark on his wrist indicate that Palm wasn't awakened. How can a mere slave be awakened? She then took a good look at her surroundings and found out that everyone was dead. Again, she questioned Palm if this entire scene was his scheme. Seriously, Palm said nothing as she continued to run her mouth. After a considerable amount of time passed, Palm asked her if she was done talking because her questioning was making him fall asleep. Anyway, she's got everything wrong, and not that anything would have ended differently if he had planned it because he would have killed her entire party either way. Hearing this made Charlotte very angry, so as she gritted her teeth in anger, she wanted to know why Palm was spouting such nonsense. Well, is because I absolutely abhor people who use slaves as bait. So with that said, Charlotte met her end. The scene shifts to the city, where several people on the busy streets took a considerable amount of their time to stare and gossip in shock about Palm as he walked by them. A bait slave who came back on his own from adventuring. Palm paid them no attention. The dice have already been thrown. Palm felt the urgency to hurry because he wanted to avoid repeating the same fate. He had a second chance and didn't need an invitation to take the opportunity that came with it. And the first step was to free himself from the slave status. At the Gaffer Merchant Union's building, a subordinate reported to the head of the building, Mr. Abbeys, that a bait slave returned back alive, alone and unharmed after adventuring. He was suspicious of Palm, and apparently Palm returning without a single scratch was part of his affirmation. Curious, Mr. Abbeys asked what was wrong with it because from his perspective it was unlikely for anyone meant to be a bait slave to return safe and sound, was it? It seems that Mr. Abbeys was not getting it, so the subordinate explained directly for the second time, saying that Palm actually came back alone because all the adventurers accompanying him died inside the dungeon, and he also made it back without a scratch as well. It was then that Mr. Abbeys fully comprehended the situation, and as he took a drag of his cigar, he agreed with the guy that it was indeed strange. And on top of that, Palm didn't run away, but actually came back on his own accord. You see, people who have been reduced to slaves were because of debt, and if they return back from a dungeon alive, they will still be a bait slave again. Despite knowing this, Palm didn't run away, but came back, and that meant that he was also aware that he couldn't get far if he did ran away because getting out of the organization's hold was extremely difficult. The sole means of escaping was through death, and that was the way of the Gaffer Merchant Union. After what he heard, Mr. Abbeys was a bit skeptical. The news was quite interesting, but it wasn't that much of a big deal, so why did he have to report it to the higher-ups? The subordinate continued with a respectful tone that there was another event that made everything just too much to ignore, and it was that the slave unlocked the first circle. What the actual fuck? Did I hear you correctly just now? Mr. Abbeys was shocked out of his wits. A bait slave was actually a first circle now. Normally, a slave would harbor negative sentiments towards the merchant union, and if things go wrong, well, Mr. Abbeys' thoughts were cut off when the guy continued that Palm asked for a change in contract. A change? Yes, it seems that Palm wants to register as an adventurer. Hearing this was like adding gas to a spark. Mr. Abbeys was a bit pissed and amused that a slave was overstepping. A lowly slave dares? He doesn't know his own heights. However, the guy then told Mr. Abbeys that Mr. Racken ordered for him to personally look into the matter with great urgency. Seriously, Mr. Racken? Mr. Abbeys was now out of his chair. Slamming his desk, he shouted with a noticeable surprise. Mr. Racken was an executive of the Gaffer Merchant Union, and showing interest in a lowly slave was for a reason. Mr. Abbeys clenched his teeth. Hard. No. Can't be for that reason, could it? Mr. Abbeys was still in thoughts when the guy left his office. He then turned to look at his window. A bait wants to actually be an adventurer. You see, under Queen Cygnus, the status of a slave shall not exist. But it's just some superficial talk, as people have always been slaves to Meso, which was their form of currency. And if they fail to pay back what they owe, they'll make up for it through labor. This notion was created by the Maple World, so slave was established. On the day when Palm's father died after an illness, he ended up becoming a slave as well. He purchased some black moss, which is an herb, on credit from the Gaffer Merchant Union, and they jacked the prices up multiple times to 1,000,000 Meso, due to him failing to be able to pay it back on the due date. He was deemed by a court to work as a laborer for the merchant union until he paid off the amount he owed. And just like that, he was subjected to work as a slave for 6 years under the union. However, this second chance he got was to get revenge as well. Palm was invited to the office of Mr. Abbeys, and across from the table were hot coffee for both of them. Palm introduced himself and recognized Abbeys as Racken's left-hand man. It seems Palm had started off at a good point. He actually caught a good fish. Abbeys started by saying that he was going to keep the conversation short with no bullshit. He then took a sip of his coffee, placed it back on the table, and asked that so Palm wants to modify his contract. Then, he was going to change Palm's contract into a person of an F-rank adventurer. Palm readily agreed, but inwardly, he knew that this fucker in front of him accepted his demands way too easily. And if he is, there will always be a catch. Mr. Abbeys was being cautious. However, Palm had no intention of playing along with Abbeys in the first place, so he requested for an E rank instead. Caught off guard, Mr. Abbeys folded his arms and said to Palm that the Adventurers Association hasn't even assigned him a rank. So why E rank? Well, it's because I have already explored over hundreds of gates in the past 3 years as a baiting slave. Mr. Abbeys then said that although Palm had had that exploration, it was under a different lens. Life as an adventurer was a whole new ballgame. Has Palm ever caught a monster before? Palm replied that when has monster hunting been a virtue for an adventurer? You see, the reason the first adventurer was able to make a name for himself was a primal instinct. Survival. The virtue of an adventurer was returning alive, since the information from a returnee can play a greater role than individual feats. Mr. Abbeys admits that what Palm said was indeed true. Palm was certainly right that surviving as a baiting slave for 3 years was no ordinary feat. However, that's all there is to it. He knows well that dungeons were ranked from low to difficult, and Palm had only been in low dungeons. Did he really think that his pathetic survival ability will work in the higher ranking gates? It seems Palm mistook the Gaffer Merchant Union as idiots who'd offer a risky contract to someone who would die without even having to pay their money back. Mr. Abbeys thought of Palm as a lunatic. He thought Palm was all that, but he would die without being able to go far. What an idiot! However, Mr. Abbeys suddenly felt a repulsive feeling from Palm. But he ignored such feeling and said there was a gate, only 5 people can enter, and it has 12 scars. Palm's eyes immediately widened when he heard this. But Mr. Abbeys saw Palm's facial expression and thought Palm was scared out of his wits. So with a smug look on his face, Mr. Abbeys continued that the bones of at least 12 parties were buried there. He then got up, casting his shadow on Palm, and with a menacing smile, he told Palm to prove his worth. If he did, then he will do as Palm says. The next day, at somewhere within the forest, Palm met with his party members. They all exude a devilish demeanor as they introduced themselves. The tank was a guy named Chev, and behind him was Tom, Max, and Roa, the only girl in the group. Chev mentions that they heard of Palm, he was the new rookie, right? And also the baiting slave who was now an adventurer. Anyway, he doesn't care about any of Palm's life history, and the same goes for his comrades. When he was done, Palm hoped that they can have a nice time working together, and he can use fire magic. Tom chimed in, asking what Palm meant by that. The elemental magic he can use was decided. Chev heard that mages can't use magic of elements other than the one they were born with. So apparently, any item that's unrelated to their element was useless for them. As simple as it may sound, it was complicated, so when Palm was about to say something, Chev didn't bother to listen. He cut him off, saying that it didn't matter. They spent too much time talking, and he doesn't know if Palm had heard already, but their mission was not monster hunting, but to safely retrieve the items left behind by the 12 parties that got annihilated before them. After that, they must return these retrieved items to the Union. Their cut was 3,000 meso for each item. Tom put on an act and said that the Union were being too much of a cutthroat. They wouldn't gain anything if they can't retrieve the items. Besides, items for adventurers of the first circle means they were worth 7,000 meso or more, and what they will be getting is half the price. Hearing this, Chev told him to stop whining, to which Tom replied that he never said he was. They banter a little bit. Then Chev told everyone that now that they were all set and ready, they should make some money together. The scene changed to a scene inside the dungeon. It was also a forest. And as they look around, Tom mentioned how the forest looks bright, but it also feels so dreary. Chev got serious and told everyone to pay attention. There was a high chance of a long battle in this dungeon with a dense forest, so they need to set up a base first. One member suggested that they use the tree beside them as the base. With all those branches, hiding and moving to other trees will be quite easy. Hearing this, Chev agreed, so they immediately started working on it. They unload their tools for the work as well. And seeing Palm just standing there, Tom grabbed his shoulder and said that he needn't worry about this kind of stuff. Setting up a base was his and his comrade's specialty, so he should just get some rest. Soon, the base was set up and it looked pretty good. So with the base done, they decided to split into 2 groups and search the surroundings. Tom, Max, and Roa were in one group and Chev and Palm was in the other. They will take the east while the others take the west, scouting. Nothing more than that. If something happens, a signal must be sent, and their priority was survival, so they need to rush to the base first. They head out, and after a while Chev wonders why they've not encountered any monsters. Did we fix our spot too early? If that's the case, then they have to move further inside the dungeon tomorrow. He then asks Palm how his first mission is looking at the moment. Palm replied that he's nervous, which made Chev laugh, saying that that's how everyone felt on their first time. He continued that he'd been an adventurer for a long time, yet every time he steps inside a dungeon, he's nervous about it. He's always been a scaredy cat, but despite this, he always found courage and confidence with those around him. Praising them might sound a bit awkward, but they were good people and he trusted them with his life. Chev said he felt bad when he heard about Palm's story. He can only imagine how hard it must have been for him. And since they were on the topic, how about Palm joins their team? Saying this, Chev finally turned and was surprised that Palm was a few distance away, staring at a footprint of something. Chev then said that he wasn't serious about what he just said, so Palm shouldn't worry about it. Night descends and the group were having a meal around a campfire. Tom continued to talk excessively, prompting Chev to reprimand him that he should just shut up already. Again, they banter for a while and Palm took a sip of his water, not uttering a word. In the middle of the night, at the base, Chev, holding a fire torch, asked if Palm was still sleeping. His comrades were behind him, and as Chev got no reply, he walked forward as Tom asked him what he was doing. However, Tom's expression suddenly morphed from concern to excitement. He laughs, saying Palm was lost in his dreams. How could he answer Chev? He continued that Chev was too cautious. Did he forget what they mixed in his food? That sleeping herb could knock out a mushman weighing 1,000 kilos. The idiot gulped down so much of it that he'd be lucky not to die from that alone. Anyway, his fire arrow wand was worth 10,000 meso. Killing him was nothing personal. So with that, Tom raised his dagger and still with his excited demeanor, he stabs the sleeping bag repeatedly. However, to his utter shock, Palm wasn't there. Chev asked from behind what was wrong. Tom shouts that Palm wasn't sleeping. He wasn't there. He then removed the blanket, freaking the rest as what was lying under the blanket was a dummy. Chev shouts that everyone should start searching for him. He couldn't have gotten far. Immediately after there was an explosion, and their base was on fire. The explosion was set underneath the base, close to the ground. Tom asks about the sudden fire outbreak, and Chev wonders how Palm could have orchestrated this. What gave them away? Their plan was flawless. However, he quickly reminds the group that they should retrieve their food and items first. Amidst the chaos, Max calls out for Chev, and points at a distance with a terrified demeanor. In front of them was a giant eyeball with a golden slime-like structure. Chev's heart immediately sank, staring at the monster, and again, he wonders if this was also Palm's doing. The monster was several meters high, and as it opens its mouth, towering the height of the base, everyone abandoned the base for cover. They quickly jumped as the monster munched on the base, reducing it to nothing. Chev screams that Palm used them as bait. Meanwhile, on a tree branch a few distance away was Palm, watching the entire scene play out with a touch of Moriarty's evil brilliance, like a puppet master watching his puppets dance to his tune. How lacking. They shouldn't have been so kind if they wanted to trick me. In a gate where over 12 parties failed and died, and they were veteran adventurers too. How can these people just welcome me? A person who was a bait slave just 2 days ago. It was obvious they were up to something. Idiots. Anyway, the boss monster of this area was this ugly-looking bastard. Well, I had an inkling that it was that thing from the broken parts, and it's bigger than I originally thought. Meanwhile, in the woods, the team made a run for it, with the monster hot in pursuit. And as Chev looked back breathlessly, he commented that their situation was extremely disadvantageous for them. Max asked if Chev knows what that monster was. If my guess is right, that thing is a gold slime. It's not something a person normally encounter in the Maple world. It's a rare boss monster that only comes out of red gates. Its body is also acidic, so it's the worst possible matchup for melee adventurers like us. However, Chev suddenly felt a chill down his spine, and instinctively, he knew what was going to happen next. So with great force, he shouts for everyone to dodge as he pushes Max out of the way, saving him from the gold slime's acid arrow. Frightened, Max asked what just happened, and so as they all stared at the hole on the ground filled with golden acid, Chev replied that the most dangerous part of the monster was its long-range attacks. Acid arrow. It was a skill that allows the monster to shoot out its body's acid. Hearing this, Max was in full panic mode, commenting that the gold slime was basically just cheating at this point. However, a loud roar from Chev brought him back to his senses. The monster was almost upon them, so they started running again, and as they did, Max asked how they were going to deal with the monster. Chev was clueless at the moment, so he suggested that they should just run and find a way to escape first or go for the core in the monster's head. Usually when a gold slime shoots an acid arrow, there was a cooldown of about 1 minute, so they just need to use that time to recover and find an opening when they get the opportunity. Hearing the cooldown effect, Tom suddenly halted, turned back with a wide grin. He then dashes forward with all his might, thinking that he had enough time to deal a blow before the cooldown time was lifted. Chev warns him about the need for them to attack together, but it was too late. Tom had already launched at the monster, and soon after, he was split in two with an acid arrow, his eyes wide opened, highlighting his shock. Chev was confused. He couldn't believe what just happened. There should have been 10 seconds left on its cooldown. The monster didn't need any invitation to shoot another acid arrow at them. Only this time, it was a direct hit, a bullseye. Their only remains were their skeletons. At this time, Palm was hiding behind a tree as the monster bypassed him. With the fight over, he knew Chev wasn't wrong. The gold slime eats items and grows stronger accordingly. So with that, the cooldown time also decreased as it got stronger. As he continued to stare at the monster's abnormal size and also wonders its almost non-existent cooldown of acid arrow, Palm now knew why the previous parties that came before had all failed. It was evident that the monster was out of its class. It has grown so much that it could be a fit for a yellow gate, which was 2 levels above a red gate. Well, it's no longer a monster that a first circle mage adventurer like me could handle, and from the looks of it, there weren't any more items left in this dungeon. Palm deemed this mission a failure, and was about to cut his loss when he remembered what Mr. Abbey said about proving himself. His expression turned serious as he decided to battle the gold slime. Meanwhile, the gold slime suddenly sensed something, so as it narrowed its eyes, a massive fire arrow struck it, exploding half of its head. One of the gold slime's eyes was destroyed. However, Palm was taken aback by the monster's magic resistance. He was sure he had aimed directly for its core but missed. Not bad. With this new development, Palm estimated that he will at least fire 5 more shots of the same magnitude to defeat it. With a rope securely tied around his waist, Palm gripped his dagger tightly and smirked brightly. Still thinking of Mr. Abbey's words, he commented that he will just have to prove himself then. At that moment, the gold slime found his location and shoots multiple acid arrow in his direction. Palm evades them all, and while in the air, he threw his dagger, which was tied to the rope, and with the help of his telekinesis ring, Palm controls the dagger, plunging it into a tree, then swinging in midair to evade the monster's relentless onslaught. Seconds later, Palm went on offense and shoot another fire arrow, which again hit the monster's head. However, that attack didn't even deter the monster for a second as it continued with its rapid shooting of its acid arrow. But Palm's nimble movement and his constant change of trajectory with his dagger and rope rendered the rapid firing of acid arrows pointless. He evaded everything. After all, one of the titles he held in his previous life was the best telekinetic. Soon after, Palm counters with a fire arrow, hitting the head for the 3rd time. At this point, Palm just repeats his actions, evading the acid arrows and finding an opening. So when he did, he fired a shot. However, the gold slime dodged it. The monster was pretty quick for its size, but it was pointless as Palm made another direct hit on its head, revealing its core in the open. Palm noticed this, and although it was obvious that it was a trap, Palm swung his rope without hesitation for his last and final shot of his fire arrow as the monster raised its hand, intending to crush him. Palm realized this, and at the last second, he changed his dagger's trajectory to the ground a few distance away from the monster. Palm was then pulled away from the gold slime's clutches as the hand slams the ground, narrowly missing him. On the ground, Palm smirks, and it seems that it was all within his calculations. So as he fires another, the monster tried to block it with its hand, but unfortunately for it, the fire arrow swiftly changed its course, swerving underneath the hand and striking the core. The core shuddered, and along with that, the gold slime immediately began to enlarge uncontrollably, and as its eyes bulge out, it realized that it was fucked in every way possible. Soon after, there was a loud explosion as Palm dashes for safety. However, the golden acid immediately began to flood the area. So he launched his dagger towards his desired tree branch, wrapping the rope around it, then quickly swings away, evading the flood. On the tree branch, Palm smirks, looking back at the river of golden acid, destroying the entire area of the forest. A while later, the acid floor eventually subsides, and as it did, Palm got off the tree branch and walked around, searching for something. He soon found it, and it was a shining red orb. He stretched his hand and pulled the orb towards him. The red orb flew to his hands almost instantaneously. In his hand, the orb began to glow brighter and brighter. Then suddenly the orb created a little dome, encasing Palm. We were then left to our imagination as the scene shifts to Mr. Abbey's office, where Mr. Abbey stares blankly at Palm with his arms folded, and after a while, he broke his silence, admitting that Palm wasn't just talking big. However, he came back alone again, and without the items he was commissioned for. Palm replied that the party he was sent in the dungeon were all newbies who tried pathetically to eliminate him and take his items. So when he ditched them, they encountered the boss monster and met a terrible end. Hearing a boss monster made Mr. Abbey's ask. It was a gold slime. When he heard this, he immediately knew that everything inside the dungeon must have been eaten away by the fucking bastard. Of course it did. It melted everything away. So with his cigar still in his mouth, Mr. Abbey's gritted his teeth in anger, cursing, because just thinking of all the rented merchant union items getting destroyed made him want to punch something. It was a loss that couldn't be ignored. And another problem was that Palm also came back alive. You see, there were a few common rules at the gates. First, the entrance number of people was limited, so only the number of people marked on a gate pillars can enter, and after that, the gate will be deactivated until everyone inside was annihilated. Second, there were entrance limitations based on the difficulty level of the gate and circle level. The gate's difficulty levels were indicated by its color, ranging from a red gate to a purple gate, and those with higher circles than the gate's difficulty cannot enter. Third, there was only one chance to raid the gate. This was the biggest obstacle when targeting gates, and if someone survives and comes out of the gate, then that gate was destroyed and cannot be entered again. So as long as the adventurers who entered the gate didn't die, then there would be no other chances. So with the gate already being a lost cause, Mr. Abbey's thought that with a gold slime being too difficult for First Circle's mages to face alone, he was curious as to how Palm survived it, and insinuated that Palm barely escaped it by running for an exit gate. However, since Palm said all the items were melted away so he was unable to retrieve them, he understands this, but regardless of the reason, the fact of the matter still remains. Palm failed to prove himself. Palm just replied that Mr. Abbey's was being too impatient. He didn't even let him finish his explanation. What? Well, about the gold slime. Palm said as he rolled up his left sleeve, shocking Mr. Abby's yet again, and proudly continued with a wide grin that he ate its orb. And on Palm's hand was a second circle. Mr. Abby's could no longer control his reactions as he shouts, asking if Palm actually absorbed the mana stone that came from the gold slime. With this new reveal, Palm said to Mr. Abby's that with the second circle, it was enough to show that he'd prove himself, right? Now, as he promised, he should grant him an E-rank adventurer's status. But Mr. Abby's next words shocked Palm greatly, and for the right reasons. He enthusiastically placed the contract in front of Palm, saying he will gladly grant him a D-rank status instead. And if Palm worked together with him, he will treat him like a C-rank adventurer also. Hearing this, Palm readily signed the contract. Normally, giving someone who wasn't even a third circle a C-rank adventurer status would be considered excessive treatment. You see, adventurer ranks were heavily influenced by circles, and the circles signified power. The difference was clearly evident. But Palm wasn't normal. You see, anyone couldn't just circle up because they use a mana stone. Did he say it was survival instinct? Mr. Abby's thought. Well, he has that survival instinct too. Actually, now that I think about it, he got an overwhelming talent. Someone who just became a first circle returned from just one adventuring, and in no time, he is a second circle? Seriously, I've never seen this speed before. On the other hand, Palm sighed heavily, thinking that his treatment improved faster than he expected. It seems Mr. Abby's is pretty impatient. Anyway, there's not much time left either. The Red Rank's first 100-member gate raid was coming. That big event that made Lithport's merchant union and guilds watched happen all around. Obviously, the Gaffer merchant union must also be quite interested in it, right? Well, there's no harm in it. I'm also in a rush. And while it's upon us, it might be a good thing to advance my plans. So with those thoughts, Palm asked Mr. Abby's for a favor. Well, what is it? Speak comfortably. Hearing this, Palm raised his hand, and with a blank expression, he asked Mr. Abby's to lend him some money. This request made Mr. Abby's mood do an immediate 180. He thought Palm was going too far, but outwardly, he had a forced smile. It's rumored by many people that the appearance of a gate started the age of adventurers, but that's just horse shit. It was all a trap orchestrated by the Black Magician. Many adventurers died in the gates, including killing off the future potential of the Maple World. And in the last day that came after, all the monsters that bided their time came rushing through the gates and humans lost. So exactly 3 years from now, the fate that the Maple World will face isn't that far off. So as Mr. Abby's took a drag from his cigar, he stared at Palm's departing figure from his window. Palm, on the other hand, thought that the money he got wasn't enough. However, it should be good enough to get started. The 100-member gate found this time is a red level, and those only up to 2 levels can enter. Usually, the Gaffer Merchant Union would only select high-circled adventurers, and the reason for them to invest in a second circle like Palm was because the Gaffer Merchant Union was aiming for that gate. So although he had obtained some money, spending it all on items would be foolish. Items that would fit his level would be too expensive. So if he was to think of something useful to buy with this money, it was to build a party. At the entrance of the slave market, Palm stared at the sign coldly. He was visiting this wretched place again, only this time as a buyer. Inside, a seller immediately started welcoming him, and around were several transactions going on. Palm wasted no time and said there was someone he was looking for specifically. Hearing this, the seller was stunned, but soon after, he guided Palm inside a holding cell. It was a place used to punish slaves that act up. They stop in front of a cell, and as the seller nervously gulped down a saliva, he points out that was this guy really what Palm was looking for. Yes, without a doubt. Palm replied as he faced a young man who was completely restrained by numerous iron chains like a wild animal. Before El Palm's regression, there was an incident where the death of a person sped up the end of the Maple World. That particular individual was the first and last student of the polearm hero named Aaron. Losing that person started a dominoes effect, and the person in question was the hero killer, Dibwa. As the two continued to stare at each other, Dibwa said he didn't know Palm, so he should get lost. Hearing this, the seller apologized, saying that Dibwa's mental state was a bit fucked up. Although Dibwa's behavior might have been different before Palm's regression, it didn't matter at the moment because he was just a slave. And it was beyond rude to still treat a slave who'd become an adventurer with the slave status. The seller sighed heavily as he continued that there was no other crazy bastard like this dog in front of them. Did Palm still want this dog? Hearing this made Palm smirk, because not only does Dibwa's personality suit his but his skills too. Alongside Palm, Dibwa was one of the few that gained attention after the last days. They were often been compared in various categories, and since they were from the same region, awakened around the same period of time, and were similarly skilled, it did not go unnoticed. But what's most similar was both he and Palm were in dire need of money. So as the seller unlocks Dibwa's iron chains, Palm asked him how much he was worth. Seeing Palm's calm demeanor and mannerism, Dibwa thought of him as an arrogant bastard who was a young master from a rich family. So if Palm was going to buy him, then his worth was 1,000,000 meso. Hearing 1,000,000 meso did not surprise Palm. After all, Dibwa was really in dire need of money. You see, his younger sister had a black blood disease, and that was Dibwa's situation. However, what he didn't imagine was that Palm will actually pull out 1,000,000 meso, agreeing to his demands. Seeing that huge sum of money made both the seller and Dibwa stared in complete and utter shock. Dibwa had never seen that much money before in his life, so he was even thinking that they might be counterfeit. I mean, who carries that much money around in his bag anyway? This act immediately shut him up. Palm explains the terms and conditions associated with gaining such money. He was to listen to whatever Palm says without hesitation. Palm then pull out a contract saying everything was in it, their contract terms were for a year, and the profit earned would be divided in the ratio 7:3. Also, the priority of choice for the items that dropped from a gate was his to choose first, then Dibwa's. The more Palm continues, the more the seller's eyes widen. He knew without a doubt that what Palm was doing was so absurd that everyone who hears it will not believe him. Trying to make a contract with a slave as a party member instead of a slave being a bait slave was unprecedented. The moment he tried handing over the contract to Dibwa, it disappeared from his hands. Because Dibwa had already snatched it, bit his thumb, and signed it in blood without even reading through. Palm was amazed with Dibwa's readiness to seal the contract. But then again, his sister's life was on the line, so what's he got to lose? With the contract sealed, Palm told him that their next stop was a gate. But seeing Dibwa's enthusiasm made Palm add that he had to prove himself also. No problem. I will work harder than anyone you'd ever seen in your life. Soon they reached their destination, which was somewhere within the Lithus forest. Dibwa was holding a polearm weapon, his new weapon, and although he was grateful for it, he was also confused because what he normally used was a long sword. Palm didn't have time to explain to him that he will be efficient and powerful with a polearm than a long sword. After all, he knew the future. So with a cold gaze, he straight up told Dibwa that he will be using polearm when working with him, or he will end the contract if he refuses. It was no skin off his back either way. That immediately put an end to that matter. Ahead of them was a red gate with 1 scar and an entry limit of 8. Dibwa looked around and with a somewhat puzzled face, he asked Palm where the rest of the party were. If his boss had deep pockets, then he's sure that hiring a few party members will be a piece of cake. Oh, and a healer too, right? I mean, fighting is fighting, but having a healer was to make sure you had a good insurance ticket. Palm just stared at Dibwa with an expressionless face, making Dibwa question why he was looking at him like that. The sudden realization made him panic a little bit, but Palm's answer about them needing not to worry, they had enough, made Dibwa relaxed. He sighed heavily, asking when the others will arrive. But Palm just raised his hand, pointing at Dibwa, who still hasn't grasped the situation. You see, they were at... What? No, you're kidding, right? Palm wasted no time and kicked him through the gate before he had had time to complain. In the dungeon, Dibwa fell flat on his face. So as he turned around, he was boiling with rage. He questioned if Palm was crazy. Doing an 8-person gate with just 2 was ludicrous. There was a limit to crazy, even for him. Or does Palm think this was a joke? Plus, he hadn't used the polearm weapon before. As Dibwa continued to whine about their situation, Palm just stared at him like he was asking Dibwa that did he think 1,000,000 meso was so he could party up. If he genuinely thought that, then he got shit for brains. Dibwa's yelling attracted unwanted visitors, the stumps, who matched towards them at full force. Dibwa raised his polearm, knowing he messed up. His yelling had brought these 3-eyed dwarfed hooligans right to them. The stumps were known for their tough bark that swords and spears struggled to pierce. And this many number on top of it just made their situation dire. Palm just walked past Dibwa, telling him to move aside. Seeing his money bag walking towards the horde of monsters made Dibwa shouts for him to wait a second. But Palm just ignored him and fired a fire arrow at the nearest monster, instantly killing it and shocking a wide-eyed open Dibwa. Soon after, several fire arrows were fired and controlled, killing multiple targets at once. The battle was over within a few seconds. And as disappointed as Palm said he was, he coldly told Dibwa to not make such mistakes again. Acting like that as soon as they entered a dungeon was something even rookies dare not do. Dibwa just listened, questioning himself quietly what kind of monster Palm was. The scene shifts to a dimly lit night, and inside an imposing building somewhere not specified. A young lady was kneeling and reporting that the merchants had taken a bait they had set. They were still working out a time for their plan, but as far as sending people to execute them, they had already picked the most capable ones. The man in front of the lady, standing behind a massive window, raised his glass of wine to the moonlight in fascination. The lady requested this mysterious person's permission to proceed, to which he agrees. Then the lady bow her head and slowly dematerialize into the shadows. The man then raised his glass of wine higher, toasting, then commenting that everything will be done according to his leader's will, which was the freedom of the Maple World. Back to the dungeon, Dibwa looted the mana stones, and they were 27 in total. Hearing that Dibwa was done, Palm told him it was time for them to move on, so they did. On the way, Dibwa was still in thoughts. He thought Palm was just a crazy bastard, but seeing him in action made him realize that he was no joke but the real deal. And was that telekinesis? I have never even heard or seen anyone using fire arrow like that. Then Dibwa started daydreaming. If he was with a talented person like Palm, then wouldn't he make a lot of money? Since the ratio was 7-3, he was sure he'd be able to save for medical and living expenses. How awesome could life be? And after a while of wondering, they found another group of stumps. Counting, Dibwa said there were 9 of them. Yes, a perfect number. Hearing this made him look at Palm with an expression questioning if he was serious. Subsequently, Palm just gave his usual blank stare to respond like, "Yes, I'm dead serious." A stone made a noticeable sound as it fell in front of a stump, and as it did, distracting the monster, Dibwa suddenly appeared above it, and with his polearm raised, he split the stump in 2 with great force. His sneak attack worked, however, the others saw this and immediately launched for his head. Seeing this, Dibwa thought this was the worst-case scenario. He had to fight them all by himself, and the annoying part was he wasn't used to his polearm. Seriously, even if I had 10 lives, it wouldn't be enough for this. Dibwa leaped backwards, cursing Palm. However, Palm just watched the entire scene, thinking that although Dibwa's movements was awkward using the polearm, he will soon realize that the polearm is the weapon that will make him the strongest. There was no need to even doubt his talent, since he was the sole person to be chosen by Aaron as her student. At that moment, a stump launched at Dibwa, using its legs as claws, but was sliced through with ease. And as he swung the long axe over and over again, he became more and more attuned to it. Realizing his proficiency, he noticed that despite it being his first time using this weapon, it had a big range attack and is powerful. If anything, it's more comfortable than a sword. Also, it feels lighter when I stop tensing up. If this goes on, I will be able to wield it even more gently. The battle rages on for a little bit, and as it did, the stumps couldn't match Dibwa's fighting intensity, so he quickly made light work of the remaining ones, slicing them up like vegetables. On the other hand, Palm saw that Dibwa had gotten the hang of the weapon quickly than he thought. And what's amazing is that Dibwa hasn't even awakened a circle yet, and he's gotten this good. Suddenly, a loud shake of the earth caused Dibwa to halt his onslaught, and as he looked at a large boulder beside him, he questioned if it was an earthquake. The boulder immediately shuddered into pieces of rocks as a huge branch of a stump came out from the ground. Dibwa was immediately attacked by the branch, and although the branch missed his assault, the shockwave blew Dibwa away, putting some distance between them. He then looked up in horror as the figure cast its shadow over him. In front of him was a giant stump named a Stumpy. As its enormous size towered Dibwa's crouching form, it launched a branch at him. But luckily, Palm was fast enough to intercept that deadly strike. He grabbed Dibwa and put a significant distance between them. Palm then tossed Dibwa aside as he ready to fire arrow. And just like that, a fire arrow was released as Dibwa watched the scene with great satisfaction. However, the monster blocked it. Seeing this, Palm shoots another, only this time, he controlled the fire arrow as it swiftly changes its course, over and over, swerving the branches as it intended to hit any opening available. The monster was still able to block it though, shocking Palm. His eyes widened seeing this, highlighting his disbelief. Then, the Stumpy suddenly went on the offense, quickly stumping towards them. Palm and Dibwa ran from the creature's destructive stumps. As they flee, Palm knew that his magical attacks weren't the problem, because if it was, then the monster wouldn't have bothered blocking them. The problem was the branches. They kept any threat away from creating any real damage. Just then, the monster stump narrowly missed them. However, the impact also blew them away, and while in the air, a branch was aimed at them. Fortunately, Palm controlled a rock underneath them and swiftly glided them to the ground. When they got up, Dibwa thanked Palm for his quick thinking and reflexes. But these creatures did not give the two a brief moment of respite as a group of stumps rushed at them. Palm told Dibwa to take care of them while he faced the Stumpy alone. Without waiting for a reply, Palm dashes at the Stumpy, and with his staff in hand, he fired a fire arrow at the monster. Dibwa watched, thinking they should have made a run for it when they had a chance. This was because the Stumpy wasn't some monster that could be defeated without a solid plan. The arrow exploded in front of the Stumpy, momentarily distracting it as a second arrow from behind pierced it. Seeing this, Debo was shocked. Well, it seems Palm did have a plan as another arrow was fired. The branches move way faster than he expected, so it was impossible to use telekinesis to evade them and attack through the gaps at the same time. However, since Palm was a two-circle mage now, he can conjure magic twice at a go. The Stumpy blocked the incoming fire arrow but was pierced again. Although Debo was fighting the stumps, his attention was on the fight between Palm and the Stumpy. Incredible, he thought. Palm was hiding another fire arrow behind the first one. So no matter how fast that annoying oversized tree was, it couldn't block two consecutive attacks simultaneously. To think that a Stumpy will be helpless to attacks like this. Seriously, this guy is more of a monster than I initially thought. At this point, it was just a one-sided fight as the Stumpy was being pierced all over, but it was a tough bastard, so going down was going to take a considerable amount of effort and time. At that moment, a few stumps rushed towards Palm from behind. It seems that Debo missed a few since there were too many of them. And these short fuckers were going to help their boss out of its predicament. Debo warns Palm of them, but it was unnecessary because in a matter of seconds they were done. Palm pierced through all of them almost instantaneously with a fire arrow. He asked Debo if he really can't handle these small fries, and the Stumpy used his brief distraction to launch a branch at him. Palm, as agile as always, dodged the attack by leaping backwards a couple of steps. However, it seems the Stumpy took a page out of Palm's book and immediately launched a second branch at Palm. As the branch was a breath away from restructuring Palm's face, Debo grabbed his shoulder and pulled him away, and at the same time, sliced the branch in half. As the two land safely, Debo tells Palm that he just saved his ass. So if anything, it cancels out the fault he just made that led to this. Oh, and no blaming shit, okay? Hearing this, Palm just smiled. It seems Debo finally seems useful. Then, let's torch this fucker. At this moment, Debo dashed forward, charging towards the Stumpy, and behind was Palm, who readied two fire arrows with the same idea earlier. And as he fired the arrows, one exploded in front of the Stumpy while the other cut off a branch, then proceeds to swerve underneath another incoming branch, distracting the Stumpy. At the same time, Debo launched at it, and in the air, he chopped off another branch. The fire arrow was aimed, and as it also pierced another branch. Palm noticed that the Stumpy was still not overwhelmed with their relentless onslaught. This was because it was attacking from both sides. Palm told Debo to attack solely from the right while he does the same on the left. The chopping and piercing of branches soon followed after. Debo lands on the Stumpy, closer to its legs, so with great efforts exerted in his legs, he dashes up the Stumpy, and in an instant, he cut off several branches. Unfortunately, a branch struck his side immediately after, making him spurt out flesh blood. Soon the Stumpy opened its mouth, intending to swallow Debo whole. However, a rock came to Debo's rescue at the last second, gliding and swiftly taking Debo from the jaws of death. But before he could make a safe landing, a branch pierced and shuddered the rock into pieces as Debo heads down for a crash landing. The situation was getting troublesome as Palm, with his telekinesis, raised a couple rocks in the air. So as Debo lands on one, the Stumpy attacked him with one of its branches. From the looks of it, the Stumpy got its eyes locked on Debo, who just can't seem to escape. The branch crushed the rock, however, the other rocks were near enough for him to leap onto them as he escapes for cover. They tried again as Palm's fire arrow created the necessary distraction for Debo to sneak from behind. In the air, he raised his pole arm and with all his might, he stroked the Stumpy's right eye. The Stumpy wallowed in pain as it staggered backwards. And as it did, the pole arm was still embedded in the eye, so Debo had no choice but to let go. He lands on a nearby rock with great force. Immediately after, he launched again at the Stumpy, only this time from the left, aiming for its other eye. He readied his left hand for his polearm, which unstuck from the right eye with the help of Palm's telekinesis. It swiftly moved to Debo's hand, and as he grabbed hold of it, he grunted, commenting that it was time for the Stumpy's dessert. He sliced the left eye as blood gushed out like a fountain. Debo then made his exit, leaping a couple steps backwards after landing. The Stumpy continued to wallow in pain, and with both eyes destroyed, it couldn't block the two massive fire arrow fired into its mouth. The arrows shuddered its core immediately after, setting the Stumpy ablaze as it screamed like a bitch. The two watched the scene, and as Palm approached Debo from behind, he praised him for his effort. Hearing this, a breathless Debo replied with the same praise. Moments after, the Stumpy was burnt to a crisp as its screams died out. The scene changes to an apartment in the evening, and in it was a young girl about to have her meal. As she stares at the food, she commented that she should quickly eat and go to bed. She closes her eyes, praying. However, A knock on her door made her wonder who could be bothering her at this hour. Without thinking much about it, she opened the door, wanting to know who it was. Her eyes widen in surprise as he stares at Dibwa, her brother. She begun to shake with uncontrolled emotions as tears dripped down her cheeks. She welcomed her brother, hugging him tightly. On the other hand, somewhere at the outskirt of the city, in a small cottage was Palm, holding his staff as he stared at his father's dead body. Several minutes went by like that, and as he looked around for the last time, he came back to his father's corpse without uttering a word. He was as calm as always as he lights up his staff. Palm left the place as he sets the house on fire. He walked away from his previous life and suffering without looking back. The very next day, Mr. Abbeys was in his office staring at some documents. He seems to be in thoughts as he commented that the 100-man gate was coming up. He was in a predicament as to how he should organize it. Sir Racken will be in charge of the squad that's going to enter the gate, and if things were to go wrong, well, that's going to stir up unwanted trouble. Also, this time around, all of the 10 major merchant unions will be focusing on the clearing of this particular gate. Loot of epic or higher was pretty much guaranteed on a 100-man gate. Even a legendary item could be a possibility. However, given the circumstances, it won't be easy. First on the list was the 3 Natasha sisters of the Goldrich Merchant Union. They were so powerful that it's hard to believe they are just 2 circle adventures. And due to this power they had, the Gaffer Merchant Union's 2 circle adventures cannot even be considered for comparison. Also, to break things down, not only the Goldrich Merchant Union, but all of the adventurers that the 10 major merchant unions were sending over were all cream of the crop. It was clearly obvious that Gaffer Merchant Union in Lith City was clearly outclassed by them all. He took Palm's file, contemplating on whether to add him to the squad, but at that moment, someone barged in without knocking, prompting Mr. Abbeys to question who dares. Immediately as he looked up, he was shocked to see that the person in question was Mr. Racken himself. Mr. Abbeys was speechless, shouting Mr. Racken's name with evident shock written all over his face. Mr. Racken approached the desk, asking Mr. Abbeys if he had prepared the list for the parties for the 100-man gate. Hearing this, he apologized that he hasn't as Mr. Racken took a seat. It was unlike Mr. Abbeys to be late. Then Mr. Racken asked about Palm. He wanted to know what Palm was capable of. Mr. Abbeys replied that Palm had some consideration that needed to be taken into account. Mr. Racken sighed hearing this. Knowing Mr. Abbeys' skeptical nature, he expected this. Mr. Abbeys continued that it was obvious that Palm is talented, but they had no way of knowing what happened in the dungeons he was in. The last time, the whole party of Chevs was wiped out. Mr. Racken then proposed they test him again before the 100-man gate. And there just happens to be a good place for them to test Palm as well. Mr. Abbeys should just gather all of the parties he was considering and let them raid the 40-man red gate. If Palm is in some shady shit, there will be many witnesses this time around. The teams gathered around the gate hours later, and Debo was happy staring at that many people. He thought this was how it should be when raiding a dungeon. A guy questioned Palm if they were the 5th party. 2 people with a slave background. Seriously, this isn't a tour. Palm watched every adventurer present with a cold gaze, and it was evident that they were not too welcoming. They were also implying that slaves, regardless whether they weren't slaves anymore, would just get in everyone's way. Well, it was normal for experienced parties to think the way they do. Also, they were around 2nd Circle and were totally different from Chev's party. They were the real pros that don't need any bait slaves. Mr. Abbeys approached them, making Palm wonder why he came in person since he almost never do. Mr. Abbeys told the parties that he will keep things short. They were going to be tested, and this was the chance for them to show their abilities to the Merchant Union. Confused, some questioned what the purpose of the test was. That's right, it's a chance to clear the 100-man gate. Everyone was startled hearing this because those who gets the opportunity to clear the dungeon will be getting special treatment. Palm listened quietly, thinking that this was how Mr. Abbeys was going to do his selection. He told everyone to give it their best shot, and that was it. The teams turned towards the gate and entered. Inside, some were a bit disappointed that it was a forest again. They agreed to go their separate way to hunt. However, the boss of the dungeon was a different matter. When encountered, a signal should be fired to alert everyone to gather at that location to defeat the boss. Palm and Dibwa watched as everyone depart, moving their parties in various directions. A mage of a group named Dolan told his party members that they will just eliminate everything that cross path with them since they don't have much time to spend in this dungeon. Suddenly, a noise a few distance away prompted he and his team to be on alert. A mushroom-like monster approached them, and Dolan, with his staff, charged an energy bolt and fired it at the monster. This made a loud blast, and as he stared at it, he thought how boring everything was. He then told a member to go pick up the magic stone so they can get moving. However, to their complete horror, the monster marched towards them unscathed. The monster's skin was so tough that Dolan's magic couldn't kill it. Soon after, before they could get their act together, they were completely surrounded. About an hour later, they managed to kill all the monsters. However, the team was completely exhausted. A member questioned Dolan what his plans was because the monsters were stronger than usual. Dolan replied that they were to go for the boss directly without any detours, including the alliance made earlier. This was what most parties will do after encountering these monsters. Palm told Dibwa after they had dealt with the monsters they encountered. A breathless Dibwa agreed with Palm's analysis, but inwardly he wondered how the monsters are so tough. And on top of that, he faced them alone since Palm refused to lend a hand. But Palm replied that there were only 3 monsters, so he should be able to handle them without his interference. Anyway, Dibwa suggested they get moving since Palm implied earlier that they shouldn't waste time with their previous strategy. Both of them had different ideas on how they were to proceed. Dibwa thought Palm meant they should just get straight to killing the boss monster, whereas Palm also thought Dibwa agreed with him to kill all the trash mobs. So as both of them spill out their intentions, Dibwa questioned Palm if what he said earlier didn't mean they should just proceed straight to killing the boss of the dungeon. Hearing this, Palm replied that he was just saying what other parties were probably thinking of doing. However, they will go with numbers. Killing the boss mob isn't the only way to get a good score, but the way trash mobs are dealt with are also important. Besides, the boss mob was dangerous, and the competition will be fierce. They also didn't know what tricks the other parties would pull, even though they shouldn't cross the line too much, but no one can be too sure. Dibwa glanced at Palm with a hint of annoyance because Palm talks and acts like he knows everything. Palm continued that he sensed something perilous about this dungeon, so they need to be cautious. On the other hand, Dolan and his team were wandering around in search of the boss mob. During their search, they encountered an exit gate. Though they weren't looking for it until later, Dolan was pleased to have found it because it will save them the hassle to looking for it later. He told his members to leave markings behind from here on out, to which they agreed. Suddenly, Dolan heard one member named Avant, who was behind him laughing aloud like he was screaming. Puzzled, Dolan questioned what was wrong with him. He was too loud. He approached Avant, grabbed his shoulder and told him that his noise will attract every trash mob in the area if he didn't pipe down immediately. But upon turning around, Avant was laughing like he wasn't in his right mind. And immediately after, he heard the rest of the team laughing as well. Dolan realized that it was poison, so he had to get to safety even if it's just him alone. He dashes for the exit gate as the poisonous mist thickens and engulfed the area. Also, behind him was the giant mushroom-like monster, the boss mob. It looks like the merging of Pennywise and the Joker. The boss mob continued to release its poisonous mist, and as it catches up to Dolan, he stopped running and started laughing like a madman just like the others. At this moment, Palm and Dibwa reached a cliff, and beneath was a running stream. Dibwa watched Palm thinking that he hadn't fought during their entire exploration. Suddenly, he noticed something, prompting him to look up. It was a fire flare, signaling everyone that the boss mob had been found. As they approached the signal's location, Dibwa said he was surprised the team actually sent a signal after finding the boss mob. Usually, the team will just proceed to try eliminating the boss for a better advantage. Palm listened while he coldly observed his surroundings. He noticed that one party was missing. The rude fucker from earlier saw that everyone has gathered, so he will start explaining. But a girl from another team questioned him to wait since Dolan's party was not there yet. However, the guy named Iburu replied that there was no point in waiting. They had found the boss monster, and when they did, they also witnessed Dolan's party getting completely wiped out. However, the problem was that the boss of this dungeon was the mad poisonous mushroom. Hearing this shocked everyone, and panic arose as the teams gave up on defeating the boss, but to rather escape the dungeon. Dibwa asked Palm if the mad poisonous mushroom was really that dangerous. But Palm just ignored him, thinking that this particular boss mob was the worst type of boss to run into at their current level. As he continued to think, Dibwa was pissed that he was being ignored like he didn't exist. Palm continued that due to the spores it spreads, it will be hard to get near it, which also implies that they can't use their number to defeat it either. So the only option was to use long-ranged attacks. And a half-assed attack would hardly do anything as it's pretty sturdy and fast regardless of its size. Iburu said to everyone that their plan to escape was not possible because the boss was in the way of the exit gate. So escaping without fighting it was not possible. Hearing everyone frightened chatter and expression made Dibwa laugh a bit. He confidently said that what's there to be scared of? The boss monster was nothing, and a single fire arrow from Palm will be enough to defeat it. Palm immediately told Dibwa to just shut it. They will die if they engage the boss without a plan. Oh, and a fire arrow wouldn't even scathe it. This revelation shocked Dibwa to his core. He was genuinely surprised hearing this from Palm, who usually challenged every monster he encountered confidently. Palm said that even the regular mobs in the gate were all tanky. Did he just forget? So with those analysis, he could even imagine how tough that fucker will be. Iburu sighed heavily, saying that they could just talk about the obvious so casually. A member of his party told him that he needn't worry about something like that at this time. They needed to find a way to get out of this dungeon. Palm raised his hand, loudly saying 50,000 meso. He will charge 50,000 meso. Iburu questioned what he was talking about. 50,000 meso per person, and since there were 30 people, it will amount to 1.5 million meso. Everyone was quiet hearing this. So Palm continued that if they do that, he and Dibwa will be the bait for them to escape. It seems Dibwa was shocked hearing this since it took a considerable time for him to process what Palm just said. When he was done, he immediately held his head in his hands in complete horror, thinking, what the fuck is this guy saying? He was really going to kill them now. And all for what? 1.5 million meso. Iburu screamed that Palm shouldn't get cocky. Palm must be used to his usual slave tactics, but he shouldn't think such tactics will work each time. And the mad poisonous mushroom couldn't be baited so easily, even if they were to go along with what Palm suggested, and they fail at baiting and dying in the process. Then they would all be dead in an instant. Slaves only get in the way in high-level gates. Iburu then shifts his anger on Dibwa, questioning if he has awakened. If not, what can Palm, a two-circled adventurer and a slave do? Dibwa was gritting his teeth hearing this. He thought he didn't even want to be a bait in the first place. But the other party had been picking a fight with them since earlier. Palm was calm as usual, questioning what Iburu plans on doing then. Did he have a better plan? Seeing Iburu's stunned expression, Palm continued that Iburu didn't have any plan because if he did, then he wouldn't have shot the signal flare. Also, Palm commented that he would make one thing clear. His party consists of a two-circled and one-circled, and not a slave. It was in that moment that a circle formed on Dibwa's hand, surprising him. He was ecstatic, shouting that he was a genius. Palm taunted Iburu, saying what rights Iburu had to question his party when his party only have a circle and two circles. The lady chimed in, telling Palm to wait. She was willing to pay if Palm and Dibwa really wanted to be a bait for them. However, they don't have such a large amount on them. Palm replied that it wasn't a problem. They will collect it when they get out. But if they couldn't, then they will just end up becoming a sacrifice. However, everyone must agree. Palm stared at them with a cold and deadly expression, making the three parties shocked with his bold attitude. He told them to decide now because time was running out. Soon after, the scene shifts back to the exit gate where the poisonous mist still lingered around. A few distance away was the boss mob devouring Dolan's party. It immediately got alerted of an incoming threat. So as it turns its head, a fire arrow was fired, hitting directly on the head. As the smokes clears, Palm and Dibwa stood a few distance away. Palm told Dibwa that they will make a run for it when the boss noticed them. The boss mob eyes lit up with rage as he stares at the two intruders daring to attack him. It dashes towards them at lightning speed, to which Palm and Dibwa made a run for it. Dibwa looked behind and saw that the boss was catching up. He asked why it was so fast. They were able to lure it away as the rest run towards the exit gate. The lady told everyone to hurry and activate the gate before the baits die. They did just that, as placing your hands on the pillars will activate the gate. Immediately as the exit gate opened, the parties rushed out. On the other hand, Palm and Dibwa were still running with the boss hot in pursuit. Dibwa's eyes widened when suddenly, a couple of trash mobs appeared in front of them, trying to block their path. Dibwa lit his pole arm with flames and leaped at them, slashing all of them in a single swing. However, in that brief moment, the boss mob caught up to him. And as it opened its huge mouth, intending to mush on him, Palm fired a fire arrow, hitting it directly in the face, causing it to fall backwards. As it got back up, another fire arrow was aiming for its face. Unfortunately, the boss mob swiftly moved to the side, dodging the attack. But unbeknownst to it, Palm controlled the fire arrow, directing it back towards it. But due to its fast movement, the monster was almost impossible to hit. It runs so fast that the fire arrow kept swerving, trying to hit or distract it for a brief second. However, it caught up to them when they reached the cliff from earlier. Without second thoughts, they jumped before the boss mob's attack could reach them. And while falling, Dibwa gave it the middle finger as Palm fired a massive fire arrow which exploded at the cliff. They fall in the stream of water as the strong current took them away. A while later, they were washed up ashore. Dibwa cursed the monster, whining that he was almost killed by it. He coughs continuously as Palm tried to dry his soaked clothes. Dibwa questioned Palm what that monster really was. It's the boss monster of this place, like I said earlier, and from the looks of it, we have to prepare a better plan if we intend on killing it. Dibwa watched Palm silently for a couple of seconds, then proceed to ask if Palm really intend to kill that giant ugly-looking bastard of a mushroom. Yes, that's precisely what we are going to do. And quit with asking the same questions over and over. Dibwa lost his shit, screaming on top of his lungs that Palm must be out of his mind. But Palm just calmly said that he didn't see what the big deal was. Didn't they come to hunt the boss in this dungeon in the first place? So what's he fussing about? Pissed. Dibwa replied that was when they didn't know that the boss was the mad poisonous mushroom. Seriously, you do know there is something called retreating, right? And they won't be able to re-enter a gate that they escaped from. Palm replied that he did know all that, but it won't make any difference since they were still going to kill the mob boss. Dibwa was angry but helpless at the same time. He thought they should just escape from the dungeon since their role as a bait was done anyway. Also, how are they going to kill that monster when Palm's fire arrow doesn't even work on it? This was suicide, and Palm also mentioned earlier that he would probably die if he tried to fight that bastard. Palm seems to have read Dibwa's way of thinking, and replied him that the situation had changed. Not fighting was initially the plan, but since the competitions are all gone, then it's a free meal. They were gonna even get bonus on top of it all. So no matter how you look at it, it's a great move. He then turned to face Dibwa, asking what was wrong with him. Was he planning of going against his contract? Hearing this, he scratched the back of his head, replying that he wasn't thinking about that. The bonus, however, Palm has to give him his share. Palm smiled hearing this, then readily agreed to give him his deserved share. Dibwa then asked how they were going to kill the monster since melee and long-ranged attacks doesn't work on it. He continued that he didn't see any way to defeat the monster. And as much as he loved money and shit like that, he had no plans of throwing his life away for the impossible. So in all seriousness, did Palm really have a way to kill that ugly bastard? Meanwhile, the gate glowed brighter, signaling that someone was exiting. So as the three parties came rushing out, Mr. Abbeys was confused how they came out of a 40-man gate this early. He asked the girl, Jubera, what happened in there, and from the looks of it, some were missing. Inwardly, he wondered if Palm was still in the dungeon. Breathless, Jubera shouted that they failed to clear the dungeon, and Dolan's party was wiped out. However, Palm and Dibwa were still inside, and they were able to escape due to them acting as bait. The boss of the dungeon was impossible for them to take on alone. Mr. Abbeys' expression turned dark as he asked her what she just meant. They were two parties short, and the only thing they could do was run with their tail tucked between their legs. Jubera said that there was nothing they could do. The boss of the dungeon was the infamous mad poisonous mushroom. Hearing this, Mr. Abbeys dropped the cigar and stump on it. He then turned around and told everyone that they should get back. Jubera was confused, so she questioned if they weren't going to help. El Palm and Dibwa have yet to come out, and seeing that the gate was still active meant they were still alive. Mr. Abbeys replied that there was no need to help. They won't survive. It was only a matter of time before they perish. After all, you said it yourself, the boss was the infamous mad poisonous mushroom. But if she wants to wait, then she can wait by herself. He didn't have time for such a lost cause. Inwardly, Mr. Abbeys cursed, calling Palm and Dibwa useless bastards. They were just unlucky. A two-circle mage killing a mad poisonous mushroom was impossible. It was a given, and he didn't have any use for average adventurers anyway. The type of adventurer he wanted was someone who could overcome obstacles and shit of that degree. Someone that could turn the impossible into possible. Back to the dungeon. Palm stood on a cliff with his staff in hand a few clicks away. He readied a massive fire arrow, targeting something at a distance. His aim was precise, and as he smirked brightly, he commented that the hunt begins now. So with that, he released the fire arrow with a terrifying speed. You see, the boss monster was faster and sturdier than the ones they had faced in the past. And on top of that, it even uses poison, which made it a pain in the ass to deal with. However, in such situations, it's best to keep a significant distance while attacking it with an overwhelming long-ranged attacks. But the fire arrow Palm can conjure currently won't be able to achieve that level of power. But with the help of his telekinesis, he could spin the arrow at a high speed, which in turn increases the piercing effect drastically. This was something only he could do in the world of Maple, something that he came up with when he thought of a bullet. A skill that made the impossible motherfucking possible. He called it the revolver. The revolver came inches away from the boss mob's head, and with a terrifying force, it pierced the mad poisonous mushroom and a couple of trees behind it. Although it was aimed for its head that holds its core, he seems to have missed, piercing its upper left chest. So as its blood gushed out, Palm noticed that the situation had gotten troublesome. The boss mob roared loudly as it turned sharply, sensing the location of the fired arrow. It then got on fours and runs at max towards Palm. As it approaches him, another revolver was fired, but the monster quickly dodges, then proceeds forward. Palm noticed that making a hit with the revolver had become significantly more difficult. And on top of that, his main problem was the cooldown of his staff. So he deduced that he had to end this fight before the boss made its way up to where he is. The monster dodges several incoming revolvers as it gradually made its way towards Palm. In front of the approaching boss mob was Dibwa, who was hiding behind a tree. So as it got closer, Palm shouted that Dibwa should make his move. Hearing this, he grabbed a rope, and with all his might, he pulled it, tripping the boss mob, as it dives head first into muddy water in front of it. It got up and stared up at Palm. Seeing Palm on top of the cliff, the boss mob roared furiously as it had totally forgotten about what tripped it. At that moment, Dibwa's polearm, which was engulfed in flames and tied to a rope, was inches away from its head. A loud cry followed after as the polearm stroked the monster's face, precisely its noses that excrete its poisonous mist. Dibwa pulled out his weapon and grabbed it a second later. So as the monster's attention shifted to solely him at the moment, Dibwa commented that the air had become a little refreshing, making his breathing a bit easier. He proceeds to taunt it, beckoning it with his finger to come play with him.